Greetings everyone and welcome back to 365 Days of Prog. Today we're going to be reviewing The Suffering Joy by the band Magic Pie.
Hi, my name's Naomi. I'm an avid progressive rock fan, but I'm a long ways from knowing all the prog albums out there. But this year, I'm gonna give it a try. This is 365 Days of Prog.
Magic Pie is a really nice little name, but it really isn't related to what I've heard on this music. And I don't mean that this album in particular doesn't have a lot to do with pies, it just feels kind of weird and unrelated in some way. I don't know what I'm getting at. Anyways, here are some of my favorite bits from this album. So today we're coming back to good old Scandinavia with a band that I personally have never heard of before this list, and they're of course called Magic Pie. They founded in Norway back in 2001, and as of today they released 5 studio albums, with the album we're reviewing today being their middle album, their third album, coming out in 2011. And for anyone who's been following this series for a while now, you'd know that I have pretty consistent opinions about Scandinavian prog, with Swedish prog generally being an amazing set of prog, Norwegian prog usually being kinda meh, and Finnish prog being basically perfect. And well, of course I am being a smartass because I only listened to one Finnish prog album and it was pretty perfect. And when it comes to today's album, I do feel that it kind of follows through with my initial perceptions of Scandinavian prog, with this one, despite being considered by many the pinnacle of this band, kind of left me with a sour tasting mouth when I finished listening to this. This album in its essence isn't really as bad as it is just not that good. But firstly, in order to understand this album better, let's talk about the band themselves. So Magic Pie have been quite transparent as always with the fact that they are heavily influenced by 70s prog bands, and yes, I do mean the contemporary ones. I think it's pretty well known what I mean when I say 70s prog bands. But these guys were trying to create music like them without ever kind of copying them, and I think that this method of influence is really felt on the music, and at no given point did I actually feel like they were copying any ideas of the past. But the cool thing about this album is that at most given moments I could have pinpointed which album or which band does this music sound like, and I think that's pretty cool. Again, this isn't your stained glass stories, it doesn't try and copy anyone, but it just kind of feels like some bands or songs, and I really like that. But this album, The Suffering Joy, is actually more than that, and it incorporates some really interesting sections of heavy prog and even slightly metal sections, which is pretty cool because after all, this is still Norway. But when it comes down to it, I feel like a lot of this album could be a great contender to being a part of the neo-prog subgenre. Yes, it is pretty obvious, an album that came out in the 2010s, they were a lot influenced by neo-prog, and this one as well has a lot of sections which are definitely neo-prog material, which is of course my least favorite subgenre of prog. As of now, this entire band and thus this album are categorized to be symphonic prog, at least over on the Prog Archives, but one could make the case that this album would better fit as part of the neo-prog subgenre. And yeah, I think that this split really defines this album for me, which on the one hand has symphonic prog elements in it, which symphonic prog, if you don't know, is probably my favorite of all the progressive subgenres, but at the same time it has a lot of neo-prog elements, which if you know me, neo-prog is definitely my least favorite. But again, I don't really hate like neo-prog that much, I just really don't like it usually because I don't think it's really prog. So if you take the both of these and you make some sort of average, you'd find an an album that is like slightly better than just being really indifferent for me. But you see, this album isn't that black and white, because when it began, it was actually really impressive and really good. So it opens up with a 24-minute long epic, which is divided up to 4 parts, which aren't equal at all. So you have the 2 first parts, which act as a sort of a prologue, which I personally thought were really nice and kind of reminded me of the beginning of Metropolis Part 2 by Dream Theater. So if you like that, you might want to go ahead and check this out. And then you have the 3rd part of a life's work, which is the grander piece, which is also pretty interesting and very nice, and starts cementing the fact that this band sounds a lot like Moon Safari at given points, which is really nice. And then of course you have the last and final track, which is also the title track, called The Suffering Joy, which this one is about 17 minutes long. It's very long, it still really sounds like Moon Safari, and it really features what I just told you about, the combination of symphonic and neo-prog together. But all in all, this opening piece is probably better than the rest of this album generally, but I will have to say that from this point onwards I kinda lost interest in the album, except for one track, which is called Slightly Mad. I think that Slightly Mad took the entire epic approach that was featured on the Suffering Joy title track, but instead of stretching it out for 17 minutes, it kinda made it more concise into 9 minutes, which to me sounded a whole lot better and made me like it a whole lot more. And I think that this album is definitely one of those cases of an album that if you just cut away big parts of it and left it with just a bit of what it had, it would have been mostly better. And personally, I find that the places where cuts are very much needed is actually where the vocals are concerned. You see, this band quite oddly has 2 lead vocalists which aren't credited for any other instruments. The 2 have eerily similar names, the first one being called Eirikur Haukson and the second one being called Eirik Hansen. Yeah, I know, it's pretty odd. And the 2 interchange their vocals throughout this entire album, but honestly at no given point was I really impressed by the vocal works found on here, and I just kind of thought they were pretty fine, but this album could have been a whole lot better if it had a better vocalist found on it. So yes, even if you crudely cut out all the vocals on this entire album, I do believe that what you're gonna be left with at the end would have sounded a whole lot better, even if it's a bit rough, and that's a lot to be said about an album, definitely one that has a lot to do with lyrics and messages. Now personally, I find that the only song on here which I really like the lyrics for is actually the song called Headlines. This one really tells a nice story and I enjoyed following this one along, but when it came to the rest I kinda didn't really see what all the point of it was, and it kinda just bored me, and this only grew as this album went along and I saw myself more and more disconnected with the music. But I really don't feel like bashing on this album anymore, but what I will say is that it's plainly obvious that the band are doing their best on this album. It is definitely felt, you can see that they're trying their finest and creating really memorable music, really good music on here. And you know what, I just kind of didn't like it. This album probably objectively is a good album, I just probably wasn't in the mood for it, or I don't know what else, but I will of course want you all to let me know what you think about this album and if you have some differing opinions or similar opinions to approach with. So yeah, all in all, The Suffering Joy isn't really my cup of prog, but at the same time I do believe that this band has all the right and necessary tools to create progressive music, which I personally really like to listen to. And you know what, for all I know, they probably have already created such an album and it's just in their discography and I don't know about it. So again, if anyone knows of this band better than me, you should at least let me know if they have any other albums which you personally like better. So this cover to me, if I'm at least not hallucinating, looks pretty much photoshopped and not actually real life made. And you can see that through the perspectives of the old person and the pier, and you know, even the clouds in the sky don't really seem like they were actually there, and who knows, maybe even the cocktail on the pier was digitally added. And this cover, in my opinion, has a pretty unique idea that was pretty poorly executed. So everything from the color palette on here, which is supposed to be concise, but because it has too many shades, it does really go all over the place, to the fact that there's really no one single focal point on this entire album cover, and it just kind of goes in every single direction. So you have like Manhattan in the background, but you of course also have the old man, which you're supposed to be focusing on, but of course at the same time there's the cocktail in the background, and there's so many ongoings on in this cover, and nothing really feels that good. And I think that a way to remedy this all would be to go in the hypnosis way and actually recreate this cover in real life and take a real picture of it. And it's not like this cover is too complicated to begin with. It's pretty basic, pretty simple, and I actually have no idea why the person or persons that made this cover didn't just opt to actually create this setting and take a real life picture of it. But unfortunately, this cover, despite having a pretty nice idea behind it, just kind of feels off to me and definitely throws me off as well, and thus results in what is essentially a bad cover. But I will admit that for the nonchalant viewer that doesn't really pay attention to these kind of things, like I was in the beginning when I first saw this cover, I didn't really find a lot bad with it, but only when I got into the nitty-gritty of it did I notice that this cover is kind of off-putting. So all in all, I didn't quite enjoy this album that much, but there were certain sections which I could have at least appreciated in it, but it's definitely not one that I'm gonna come back to anytime soon, so it will get a pretty underwhelming rating of 6 out of 10. But that's about it, guys. I hope that you enjoyed this video, and stay tuned for tomorrow because we're going to be listening to For Girls Who Grow Plump in the Night by the band Caravan. You all know them, you all love them, and this is going to be an interesting ride. I of course want to thank my lovely supporter over on Patreon, so thank you so much to Clay Walnum, you are the best. And if any of you want to support me over on Patreon, you can find the link down in the description or in my About page. But that's about it, guys. Have a wonderful day, and I'll catch you all tomorrow. Bye, guys.